It was a typical morning at the supermarket. The fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting a cold, clinical glow over the aisles. Customers strolled in and out, picking up their groceries without a second thought. But today something was different. Ernesto, the owner of the largest supermarket chain in the country, was walking in quietly through the automatic doors, blending in with the crowd. His usual sharp suit and polished shoes were absent. Instead, he wore a worn-out baseball cap, oversized dark sunglasses and a faded t-shirt. He was tired. Tired of the reports, tired of the board meetings, and tired of the endless parade of sycophants. Today he needed to see something for himself. He'd received too many complaints from employees, complaints that didn't seem to match the company's outward image of kindness and respect. Complaints about mistreatment, bullying, and harassment. He had to know if they were true. With his grocery cart in hand, he moved through the store like any other customer. He wandered through the aisles, observing employees from a distance. His gaze was methodical, scanning for signs of discontent, anything that could hint at the darker truth he suspected. As he made his way to the checkout lanes, he saw her. Daniela, the young cashier. She was no more than 23 years old, with a tired expression that suggested she hadn't slept in days. Her hands trembled slightly as she scanned the groceries, but it was her eyes that caught Ernesto's attention. They were red from crying, filled with a deep sadness that no amount of makeup could cover. Ernesto stood silently in line behind a customer, watching her every move. He noticed how hard she tried to smile at the customers, how she forced herself to appear calm, even though her body language screamed of brokenness. It was almost as if she were hiding a pain so deep that no one could understand. And then he saw it. The manager approached the counter, a man in his mid-40s dressed in a sharp suit and tie. His shoes gleamed in the fluorescent light, and he walked with an air of superiority. But instead of greeting Daniela or asking how her day was going, he began to berate her in front of everyone. His voice, condescending and loud, echoed throughout the store. "Not again, Daniela," he sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're always late, always messing things up. How many times have I told you to get it together?" His words were sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. Daniela's face turned pale as she looked down, her eyes filling with tears that she desperately tried to blink away. She was trembling, and it was clear she was on the verge of breaking. But the manager didn't stop. He continued to humiliate her, his words becoming more venomous with every passing second. "I've had enough of you, Daniela. You're worthless. Do you even know how to do your job?" Ernesto stood there, motionless, as the manager continued his tirade. It felt as if the air had thickened with every cruel word that left the manager's mouth. The supermarket, bustling just moments ago, now seemed to pause in time. Everyone was silent, watching but too afraid to act. The manager's voice echoed off the walls, growing louder with each insult he hurled at Daniela. "Are you even trying? You're not cut out for this. I don't know why I haven't fired you already," he roared. The words seemed to hit her like physical blows. She shrank, her shoulders slumping even lower, as if the weight of his words had crushed whatever resilience she had left. Ernesto could feel his chest tightening. He clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white under the pressure. His mind raced, torn between the need to intervene and the patience he needed to verify his suspicions. He had to be certain. The manager, clearly enjoying his power, took a step closer to Daniela. "If you're going to be this useless, I'll just send you back to the stockroom to do something you might actually be good at, sorting cans. But I warn you, don't mess that up either." Ernesto could feel the anger bubbling inside him like a volcano on the verge of eruption. He could see it in Daniela's face, the helplessness. She was fighting back tears, trying to maintain some semblance of control, but it was clear she was losing the battle. He was about to step in when a soft voice interrupted him. "Excuse me, sir, but this is unacceptable." A woman in the line behind Ernesto spoke up. She wasn't loud, but there was an undeniable strength in her voice. She wasn't going to stand by and let this continue. The manager's head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing in disdain. "Mind your business, lady. This is none of your concern." His voice was cold, dismissive, the kind that spoke of entitlement. But the woman wasn't backing down. "I'm sorry, but I don't think treating someone like that is okay no matter what." Her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of righteousness. Ernesto couldn't help but admire the woman for speaking up, but he could see that it wasn't enough. The manager was too far gone in his arrogance. He could feel the tension mounting, the moment hanging in the balance. The silence that followed was deafening. The manager took a step closer to the woman, his face contorting with anger. "You better keep your mouth shut unless you want to get yourself kicked out of here too." The crowd grew uncomfortable, but no one dared to say anything. The air was thick with fear. Ernesto's gaze turned back to Daniela, whose shoulders were shaking now. She was holding back sobs, trying to keep her composure, but it was clear she couldn't do it much longer. That's when Ernesto made his move. Without a word, he pulled out his phone and began recording the scene. His fingers moved swiftly as he captured the manager's face, his insults, and the broken expression on Daniela's face. It was a silent act, but it spoke volumes. Ernesto knew that the video would speak for him. It would be irrefutable evidence of the injustice happening right in front of him. "You're worthless. Do you hear me?" The manager's voice was seething with contempt as he leaned in closer to Daniela, towering over her like a predator. But Ernesto didn't flinch. Instead, he stood tall, the camera still recording, capturing every word. The crowd was starting to notice. Some were beginning to murmur, their eyes darting between the manager and Ernesto. There was a growing realization that something was about to happen. "You're fired." The manager's final words rang out with a finality that left no room for doubt. He was proud of his authority, but little did he know that the balance of power was about to shift. Ernesto, his heart pounding, approached the counter slowly. He took off his sunglasses, revealing his sharp, piercing gaze. The manager didn't notice at first, too consumed by his own ego. It wasn't until Ernesto spoke that the entire room seemed to freeze. "That's your idea of leadership?" Ernesto's voice was deep and steady, resonating with quiet authority. He spoke slowly, clearly, every word landing with precision. The manager paused mid-sentence, his gaze flicking up to Ernesto's face. "Who do you think you are, talking to me like that?" The arrogance in the manager's voice was evident, but there was a tremor of uncertainty beneath it. He had no idea who Ernesto was, and that uncertainty was his undoing. Ernesto didn't answer. Instead, he pulled his phone back out and raised it in front of the manager's face. The manager's face turned pale as he realized that the entire confrontation had been recorded. The manager's bravado faltered. "What are you going to do with that?" he sneered. "I'm going to show it to the world." Ernesto's words were calm, but they carried the weight of justice. As Ernesto spoke, a ripple of recognition passed through the employees. The murmur of realization swept through the store like wildfire. The employees recognized him now. It wasn't just the way he held himself, the air of authority he carried, it was the way people had started to react. The manager's face drained of color, and for the first time, there was genuine fear in his eyes. He could no longer hide behind his position. The sub-manager, who had been standing nearby, finally took notice of the scene. She glanced at Ernesto, her eyes widening in recognition. "Wait, you're Mr. Ernesto," she stammered, her voice cracking. The store fell into stunned silence. Ernesto didn't speak. He simply looked at the manager, the weight of his gaze enough to make the man sweat. "You don't understand, do you?" Ernesto said quietly. "Leadership isn't about power. It's about respect. And respect doesn't come from fear." The manager's mouth opened, but no words came out. Ernesto looked at Daniela, who was still standing behind the counter, her hands shaking as she wiped away her tears. "Daniela, I'm sorry you had to go through this. But it's going to end now." The sub-manager, still shocked, walked over to Ernesto. She looked at him, her face pale with the realization of what had just unfolded. "Mr. Ernesto, I didn't know." Ernesto turned to face her. "That's the problem. People are too afraid to speak up. But it's time that changes." His voice was unwavering, like a man who knew exactly what had to be done. He turned his gaze back to the manager, whose posture had crumbled. "You're fired." The manager, in disbelief, sputtered, "You can't do this. I'm irreplaceable." Ernesto's expression hardened. "You're right. You're irreplaceable. But not in the way you think." The manager was escorted out of the store, his head hung in shame as the employees watched with a mix of awe and fear. Daniela remained at the counter, her face still wet with tears, but now there was a look of relief in her eyes. As the crowd began to disperse, Ernesto walked over to Daniela. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle yet firm. "You've been through a lot today, but things are going to change now." Daniela looked up at him, her eyes filled with disbelief. "But why did you help me?" Her voice was shaky, as though she was still unsure whether any of this was real. Ernesto smiled softly. "Because no one should ever be treated that way. No one." A few employees who had been watching in silence began to approach. They clapped slowly at first, unsure, but then the applause grew louder, more genuine. One by one, the employees began to speak up, sharing their own stories of mistreatment, each revelation like a weight lifting from their shoulders. The applause in the store seemed to echo in Daniela's mind long after the last clap faded. She stood there, still in shock as Ernesto's presence began to settle over the atmosphere like a protective blanket. The tension that had gripped the store moments ago was lifting, replaced with a sense of freedom that Daniela hadn't known she needed so desperately. Ernesto gave her a moment to process everything before speaking again. "We don't just talk about respect, we live it." His voice was gentle, but there was an underlying strength that resonated with everyone who heard it. Daniela finally found her voice, albeit a small and trembling one. "But what happens now?" She wiped her eyes again, this time trying to gather herself. Ernesto smiled, his gaze steady and reassuring. "Now we make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." He turned his attention to the rest of the employees, who had gathered around to witness the change unfolding before them. "We all deserve to work in a place where we're treated with dignity," he continued, speaking to everyone, not just Daniela. "Starting today there's going to be a new standard here, one where respect isn't optional." Some of the employees, still hesitant, exchanged looks with one another. But Ernesto's calm yet commanding presence was enough to push them past their fear. Slowly they nodded in agreement. Ernesto turned back to Daniela. "You don't have to fear losing your job anymore. In fact, I'm giving you a promotion." Daniela blinked in confusion. "A promotion? Me? But I don't understand." Ernesto's smile widened. "I've seen your strength today. You stood up in a situation where most people would have crumbled. That's the kind of person I want in leadership." Tears welled up in Daniela's eyes again, but this time they were tears of gratitude. She hadn't expected her life to change in this way, so suddenly, so dramatically. She had just been trying to survive, trying to make it through the day, and now here she was, offered a chance to thrive. As the news of Daniela's promotion spread, so did the story of what had happened that morning. It wasn't just about a manager being fired. It was about standing up for what's right and showing that true leadership isn't about control, but about empowering others. The atmosphere in the store had completely shifted. The employees who had been too frightened to speak up before now found their voices, and one by one, they shared their own stories of mistreatment, of times when they felt invisible or disregarded. Each story felt like a piece of the puzzle falling into place, each revelation a sign that the culture at this supermarket had been toxic for far too long. Ernesto knew this wasn't just a single incident, it was a larger pattern that needed to be broken. And he wasn't about to let it go unnoticed. Later that day, Ernesto called a meeting with the rest of the supervisors and managers from the store. The room was quiet as they gathered, unsure of what to expect. Ernesto had told them about the incident with the cashier, but he hadn't shared what was to come next. He stood at the head of the table, his gaze piercing yet calm. "I want you all to understand something very clearly," he began, his voice unwavering. "What happened today was unacceptable, and it should never have been allowed to happen in the first place. This store and every other store under my name will have a new approach. We will lead with respect. And that starts now." One of the managers, a man in his late 30s, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had witnessed the manager's behavior toward Daniela but hadn't said anything at the time. Ernesto turned his eyes to him, recognizing the discomfort. "You all have a choice," Ernesto continued, his voice sharp. "You can either stand with me and make sure we treat our employees with dignity, or you can find another job." The message was clear. This was no longer about power or titles. It was about integrity. The room was silent for a moment before another manager, a woman who had been working at the supermarket for over 10 years, spoke up. "You're right, Ernesto. We've been letting things slide for too long. I'm ready for a change." Her words seemed to break the ice, and one by one the other managers nodded in agreement. They knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but they were committed to the idea that a healthy workplace culture wasn't just a luxury, it was a necessity. Ernesto didn't just stop at changing the culture in this one store. He made it clear to his team that accountability would be at the core of everything moving forward. The rest of the stores in the chain were soon to follow, with new systems put in place to ensure that employees were treated with fairness, respect, and empathy. Ernesto spent the next few weeks visiting other branches incognito, just as he had done in this one. Each time he observed how employees interacted with customers and with each other. Each time he took notes and watched for signs of respect or lack thereof. And each time he was more convinced that this was just the beginning. Back at Daniela's store, things were improving. No longer did employees walk with their heads down in fear. The team spirit had been reignited, and people started to feel a sense of pride in their work. One morning, Daniela arrived at work to find a small group of her colleagues gathered around a table. They were planning something special. "We wanted to thank you, Daniela, for being the one who changed everything." One of the employees, a young woman named Carla, spoke up. "You stood up when no one else did. You gave us all the courage to speak out." Daniela, still adjusting to the change, smiled sheepishly. "I just did what anyone else would have done." But she knew it wasn't just that. What she had done was speak up, and in doing so she had empowered an entire team. It wasn't just about getting her promotion, it was about making a stand for everyone who had been silently suffering. That day Ernesto returned to visit her. He found her standing at the customer service desk, chatting with a few employees. There was a new light in her eyes, a kind of confidence she hadn't had before. "You look different, Daniela," he said with a smile. She met his gaze with pride. "I think I've finally found my voice." Ernesto nodded, pleased with the transformation. "Good. Keep using it. The world needs more people like you." As he walked away, he couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something much larger. If one act of kindness could ripple through a small team and change the way they treated each other, what could happen if the entire world embraced the same principles of respect, integrity, and leadership? And in the end, Ernesto realized that the most powerful leaders weren't those who demanded respect, but those who earned it through their actions, their choices, and their willingness to stand up for what was right. The transformation in the store was palpable. Each morning, the employees seemed to walk with a renewed sense of purpose, their eyes not only scanning the shelves but also watching out for each other. There was an unspoken sense of unity that hadn't existed before, a collective understanding that their worth wasn't tied to the whims of one manager or any single person. But while the immediate environment had improved, Ernesto knew this wasn't just a one-time victory. Justice, true justice, had to be a consistent force, not just an isolated event. The company's new leadership structure wasn't just about offering promotions or reprimanding wrongdoers. It was about creating a sustainable culture of respect and accountability. Ernesto was aware that one good deed didn't fix everything overnight. He was aware that the battle for respect and dignity was ongoing. But today he had made a difference. Today he had inspired change. And it was a change that would ripple outward, touching lives far beyond this single store. Ernesto began implementing a series of leadership seminars for all the branch managers and team leaders, where he spoke openly about the importance of compassionate leadership. He shared the story of what happened that day in this very store, to highlight the consequences of unchecked power. He discussed the psychology of abuse, how the smallest acts of disrespect could erode morale and destroy loyalty. "A leader doesn't demand obedience, they inspire respect," he would tell them. "True leaders know that their role is to lift others, not to push them down." These seminars became a cornerstone of the company's new ethos. They weren't just focused on profitability or operational strategies, they focused on humanity. For once, the company's most important asset wasn't the balance sheet or market share. It was the people who made it all possible. The transformation didn't stop with just Ernesto's stores. Word began to spread. News outlets picked up the story of the disguised millionaire who stepped in to right an injustice. Social media buzzed with the hashtag respect in leadership. People everywhere began to share stories of mistreatment they had faced in the workplace, and how they too had longed for someone to stand up for them. Daniela became a symbol of hope. Her face, once weary and defeated, now graced interviews and articles. She was no longer the broken cashier, she was the embodiment of resilience. She spoke about how her life had changed, how one act of kindness had led her to not only stand up for herself, but to inspire others to do the same. Ernesto, though proud of her, reminded her of something important. "You didn't just rise because of me, Daniela. You rose because you chose to stand tall in a situation that most people would have let pass. That takes strength." Daniela, always humble, shrugged with a shy smile. "I'm just happy to be here. I want to make sure no one else has to go through what I did." Back at the store, Daniela's promotion was just the beginning. As the weeks went on, she took on a more visible role as the supervising cashier. She wasn't just a figurehead, she became a mentor. Daniela was the first to speak out if something wasn't right, whether it was an issue with an employee or an irregularity in the treatment of customers. Her approach wasn't to command respect but to earn it through empathy. She made it a point to get to know each of her colleagues personally. She wanted to understand what motivated them, what their struggles were, and what they hoped for in their careers. She took the time to make everyone feel valued. And the employees responded in kind. The morale in the store shifted dramatically. There was a renewed sense of teamwork. Employees began collaborating on new ideas to improve customer service, and customer satisfaction skyrocketed. Customers could feel the difference too. Word spread about the store's new atmosphere and foot traffic increased. People wanted to shop at a place where they felt respected, where they knew the staff was treated fairly. For Ernesto, the success of the store wasn't just a professional achievement, it was personal. The transformation wasn't just about his company, it was about his own journey toward leadership. Before this experience, Ernesto had been like many high-level executives. Detached, focused on the big picture, driven by the need to grow profits and expand market share. But now he was different. He had seen firsthand the impact that leadership with integrity could have. He reflected often on the lessons his mother had taught him, lessons about hard work, sacrifice, and dignity. His mother, a single parent, had worked in retail for years to support him and his siblings. She taught him that a person's value wasn't determined by the job they did or the money they made. It was about their character. It was that foundation of humility and respect that had shaped him into the leader he had become. And now, as he walked through his stores, he understood just how much those values meant. A company built on respect would never falter. One afternoon, while visiting another branch of his supermarket chain, Ernesto had a chance encounter that would change his perspective even more. He was in the produce aisle, inspecting stock levels, when an elderly woman approached him. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I just wanted to thank you. I've been shopping here for years and I've never seen this kind of change before. It's a relief to see that people are finally being treated with respect." Ernesto smiled warmly, touched by her words. "It's the least we can do, ma'am. Thank you for sharing that with me." The woman shook her head, a smile spreading across her face. "No, thank you. I've been in retail all my life and I've seen how easy it is for people to be treated like they don't matter. You've made this a place where it's obvious you do care. I'll keep shopping here for as long as I can." Ernesto's heart swelled with pride. This wasn't just about transforming one store. It was about impacting the lives of everyone who entered. The ripple effect had already begun, and it was going far beyond what he had anticipated. Ernesto knew that his journey was far from over. There was still much work to be done. As he prepared for his final rounds of store visits, he made a decision. He would formalize the changes by creating a company-wide initiative. He would ensure that no manager could get away with toxic behavior again. A corporate policy was drafted, focusing on the values of respect, integrity, and accountability. There were new hiring protocols, leadership training programs, and a zero-tolerance policy for mistreatment. Ernesto committed to making sure that every employee, from the cashier to the CEO, felt valued and seen. With this policy in place, the company's culture truly began to shift, and Ernesto knew that, at least in his company, the old ways of mistreatment and fear would never be tolerated again. He was proud to leave a legacy built on respect, one that would impact generations of employees to come. As Ernesto sat in his office, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here, he couldn't help but smile. The journey wasn't over. It would continue, growing stronger with each passing day. But he had learned an important lesson. Leadership wasn't about having power, it was about using power responsibly. The world had changed that day in his supermarket. And in the grand scheme of things, it was a small change. But in the lives of the people who worked there, it was a game changer. As Ernesto looked out of his office window, he thought of Daniela, of the employees who had spoken up, of the customers who would return, knowing that they were supporting a company that truly cared. He thought of his mother, the woman who had taught him everything he knew about humanity and leadership. And he knew that, as long as he lived, this would be the legacy he would leave behind.